unilaterally change the status quo in the East China Sea, and thus raises regional tensions and increases.
We're leaving this, which you can see at cspan.org, to go live to the House.
We are consulting and coordinating closely with Japan, the Republic of Korea, and
or on which the votes incur objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3547, the Space Launch Liability Indemnification Extension Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3547, a bill to extend the application of certain space launch liability provisions through 2014.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 3547, the bill now under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the bill we consider today provides stability for our nation's commercial launch providers so that they can remain competitive in the international market. The bill extends the existing system, which requires commercial launch providers to purchase insurance up to the maximum probable loss. It then provides that the government will compensate up to $1.5 billion plus inflation, and any amount above that is the responsibility of the original commercial launch provider. 2 weeks ago, the Space Subcommittee heard testimony from industry experts about the need to extend the Commercial Space Launch Act's risk-sharing system. 2 of the witnesses who testified deal with this law on a regular basis. Mr. Stuart Witt, president of the Mojave Air and Space Port, is developing new launch systems and technologies that could revolutionize space by making it more accessible. He told the subcommittee that this law allows companies to continue to innovate and grow. Another witness, Ms. Patricia Cooper, president of the Satellite Industry Association, represents companies that add billions of dollars to the U.S. economy as a result of the current risk-sharing system. Ms. Cooper testified that the system's continuation is absolutely essential and that her association strongly recommends that it be renewed before it expires. The committee also received a letter signed by Digital Globe, Boeing, Virgin Galactic, Lockheed Martin, American Pacific Corporation, Aerojet Rocketdyne, ATK, Ball, Honeywell, AMT2, and Orbital Sciences that advocated the renewal of the risk-sharing system in order to keep the U.S. competitive in the global market. Last year, the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee held a separate hearing on indemnification and heard from the Federal Aviation Administration, the Government Accountability Office, Digital Globe, and the Aerospace Industries Association. At this hearing, Frank Slazer with the Aerospace Industries Association summed up his trade association's position by stating, "Many foreign launch providers competing against U.S. companies already benefit from generous indemnification rules. We cannot afford to drive away highly skilled technical jobs to foreign countries where the regulatory frameworks provide better critical risk management tools. Lastly, a non-renewal could impede new U.S. entrants to the commercial launch market, discourage future space launch innovation and entrepreneurial investment. Without a level playing field for competition, new U.S. entrants could find it highly undesirable to begin their business ventures in the United States." End quote. The FAA Launch Indemnification Authority has been in place for over 20 years, and the American commercial space industry has benefited significantly over this time. Thankfully, the provision has never been triggered by a serious accident, but the stability it provides allows the U.S. to remain competitive in the global market and push the boundaries of space technology. The bill before us would extend indemnification for 1 more year with the hope that we can address a longer-term legislative solution. I would have preferred a longer extension. For instance, the NASA Authorization Act that the Science, Space and Technology Committee passed last summer extended indemnification for 5 years. But we now have a bipartisan bill before us that provides stability to our commercial space industry by protecting companies against third-party liability claims. This provision expires on December 31st, so time is short. This bill buys us time to work on a long-term extension as part of the larger Commercial Space Launch Act renewal that we will take up next year. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise today to speak in support of H.R. 3547, a bill to the application of certain space launch liability provisions through 2014. First established by Congress as part of the Commercial Space Launch Act amendments of 1988, the Commercial Space Transportation Risk-Sharing Liability and Insurance Regime has been extended 7 times since its original enactment. The current extension expires on December 31st of this year. So it's important for Congress to act now so that there is sufficient time for this legislation to make its way to the President's desk before the current authority expires. The liability and insurance regime that would be extended by this legislation is 3-tiered. In the first tier, licensed commercial launch providers are required to purchase third-party liability insurance to compensate for possible losses from the third-party claims by an uninvolved public, up to the maximum probable loss level determined by the Federal Aviation Agency Administration. As part of this licensing process, or a maximum level of $500 million. In the second tier, the claims above those maximum probable losses, and the U.S. government may pay successful liability claims up to $1.5 billion in 1989 dollars, or about $2.8 billion in today's dollars, subject to the funds being appropriated by Congress for that purpose. In the third tier, for successful claims above the aforementioned $2.8 billion, the licensee assumes responsibility for payment. It should be noted that the U.S. government has not appropriated a single dollar to pay for the third-party claims in the 2-decade history of this program. The existence of this liability risk-sharing regime has helped enable the development and sustainment of a commercial space launch industry in the United States, including the emergence of several new companies in recent years. In addition, the regime has allowed U.S. companies to remain competitive with their international counterparts. Almost all of those governments provide similar or more generous risk-sharing liability to regimes to that of the U.S. The Commercial Space Transportation Liability and Insurance Regime has worked, has not cost the American taxpayer a single dollar in claims, and has strengthened U.S. competitiveness in commercial space launch. And this is not a blank check, since any potential payment for claims would be subject to prior congressional appropriation. The bill before us today extends the liability risk-sharing regime for a period of 1 year. While that is less than some in the industry would like, I believe it is an appropriate length. That is because much has changed since the risk-sharing liability and indemnification regime was established in 1988, and the commercial space launch industry continues to evolve over time. Commercial providers are delivering spacecraft to orbit and commercial resupply services to the International Space Station, and companies are working hard toward providing commercial human space flight. I'm excited about the entrepreneurial spirit many of these new companies exhibit, and I want them to succeed. But I also want to ensure that the nation's commercial space transportation legislation reflects the change in industry and protects the American public. The commercial space industry has been evolving in ways that were not envisioned when the risk regime was first established, and we need to reevaluate if changes are needed to this decades-old law. The 1-year extension provides the Congress with the time to conduct necessary hearings, perform our due diligence, and enable the enactment of comprehensive update to existing commercial space legislation. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I'd like to thank the Chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Ms. Lamar Smith, Chairman of the Space Subcommittee, Steve Palazzo, and the subcommittee's ranking member, Donna Edwards, for co-sponsoring this bill with me. This is a good bipartisan bill, and I urge members to support it. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, who is the Vice Chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I rise in strong support of H.R. 3547, the Space Launch Liability Indemnification Extension Act. And I want to congratulate the chairman and the ranking member for, again, demonstrating the type of bipartisan support that we have for legitimate science and space projects here in the United States Congress. People say we can't work together. Well, we can keep our eyes on the stars and on the positive things, and we are working together, and this piece of legislation proves just that. It wasn't so long ago there was a lot of people who were skeptical about the commercial space industry, and it is heartening to see that we now have gathered together to make sure that our American entrepreneurs, our space entrepreneurs, are successful, and that they do indeed launch not only rockets into space, but launch a whole new industry, providing great jobs for the American people into space and thus benefiting all of us. That's why it's a bipartisan effort that we're talking about today. The Space Launch Liability Indemnification is important for the American launch industry, which is once again, as I said, regaining a global market share to maintain the global market expectations, and of course also because it's important to maintain standards that have been long expected of American companies. I fully support a deeper look into this issue, which this legislation provides, because I know that our indemnification structure is not just right for industry, it's right for the American people. It's important to note that indemnification is not a one-way street, with the government just protecting industry. The original policy back in 1988 was designed to protect the government as well as industry. When companies buy the insurance required by law, they protect the federal government against damages and against damage claims up to the maximum probable loss. I would also note that requirements for commercial launch providers purchase and the requirements that they purchase insurance and protect the federal government against that liability, that never expires. So we should permanently extend the Space Launch Liability Indemnification, and I look forward to working with the chairman and the ranking member to accomplish just that as we go into their next year. And I again rise in strong support and thank my colleagues for joining me in this effort to make sure we launch this whole new industry for America.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Pompeo.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the ranking member for yielding her time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 3547, the Space Launch Liability Indemnification Extension Act. As a proud member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, I am encouraged to hear about the exciting and innovative ways that the commercial space industry is pushing the bounds of space exploration. The legislation on the floor today helps to ensure that the industry will flourish and continue to create new high-tech jobs. In Southern California, the Hawthorne-based SpaceX company employs nearly 4,000 workers and has cemented itself as one of the premier commercial space enterprises by developing several launch vehicles and reusable spacecraft. In 2012, SpaceX successfully delivered cargo to the International Space Station using its Dragon capsule. The Mojave Spaceport is another bright light in the commercial space industry. At Mojave, more than 70 companies are working on highly advanced aerospace design and flight test research. Just 2 months ago, the Sierra Nevada Corporation completed its first free flight test of the Dream Chaser, a winged spacecraft that could one day take astronauts to the International Space Station. But as commercial space companies such as SpaceX, Sierra Nevada, Virgin Galactic, and others continue to develop and test new technologies, it is important for the federal government to help alleviate some of the risk involved in undertaking such projects. By providing third-party indemnification, these companies can continue their work without risking their entire assets. In fact, Russia, China, France, and Japan all offer liability protections that exceed the United States standard. Without this important protection, some companies could be forced to exit the market, costing the United States hundreds, if not thousands, of high-tech jobs. We cannot allow that to happen. I am proud to support this legislation so that American commercial space companies can continue to grow and expand the possibilities of what mankind can achieve. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, we have no other speakers at this time, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I probably will not use all of the 5 minutes, but I wanted to be here today, Mr. Speaker, to support H.R. 3547, the Space Launch Liability Indemnification Extension Act, of which I am an original co-sponsor. I want to thank both our chairman, the chairman of our subcommittee, Mr. Palazzo, Chairman Smith, and of course our ranking Democrat on the committee, Ms. Johnson, because we would not have been able to get to this point if we hadn't been able collectively across the aisle to work on a one-year extension that would be provided for in Commercial Space Launch Act amendments of 1988 that established the government private risk-sharing regime for third-party liability, and should a launch accident occur, the effects that involve the public and property on the grounds, then this indemnification provision would cover such losses. You know, it turns out that commercial space launch capacity in the industry is really at a critical point in our nation's development of our space infrastructure. Both the federal and commercial customers rely on commercial space launch, the industry for safe, reliable, and effective service in delivering payloads in orbit and providing related space transportation services. Just recently, in September of this year, a commercial space launch provider successfully lofted a cargo capsule into space to carry supplies to the International Space Station. This is exactly what we have in mind when we talk about integrating our commercial launch capacity with what we do already at NASA in terms of our scientific endeavors. Mr. Speaker, commercial space transportation services have really always been carried out in partnership with the United States government through the use of federal launch ranges and services, for example, and through the government risk-sharing regime for protecting the uninvolved public and property should an accident occur. And so it seems quite fitting that we've reached this point today. Unfortunately, the reason that we're only able to do a one-year extension and agree on that is because there are also some other things that we need to figure out for the future with respect to the involvement of the commercial industry. And it is my hope that over the course of this 1 year that we will use that time wisely here in the Congress to have the kind of oversight hearings that we need to bring in the FAA so that we can make sure that we're venturing in this direction in the right kind of way that really takes into consideration what we're doing in the 21st century. New entrants are delivering spacecraft to orbit, commercial resupply services to the International Space Station, and companies are working toward providing commercial human spaceflight on both reusable suborbital vehicles and orbital human spaceflight systems. In fact, I'm excited, although I have been admittedly a skeptic, I'm excited about the potential of the industry, and I want it to succeed. Just last year, in a hearing on launch indemnification before the committee's Space Subcommittee, of which I am the ranking member, a senior official representing the Aerospace Industries Association characterized the continuation of U.S. space launch indemnification as providing, quote, substantial upside potential to enable new markets, create jobs, and assure U.S. space technology leadership for the 21st century. It's easy to see how that upside is both national and local in scope. The launch capability at nearby Wallops flight facility on the eastern shore is becoming a critical link to resupplying the International Space Station. Commercial space companies make investments in our economy and create jobs all across the country. And specifically in my home state of Maryland, companies like Lockheed Martin, Orbital, Northrop Grumman employ thousands of people in my district alone, creating high-tech jobs, high-skilled jobs in the local community. ATK is a leading aerospace supplier and has its main headquarters right up in Beltsville, Maryland, not very far from here. Mr. Speaker, I want to ensure that our legislation and policies regarding commercial space transportation reflect the changing industry. Changes and activities that may not have been contemplated when the liability and indemnification regime was first established. This one-year extension provides Congress the opportunity to consider any potential changes that might be needed to ensure the continued safety of the public. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge our colleagues to join us today in supporting H.R. 3547, and I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time if the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is prepared to yield back her time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I have no further requests for time, so I would just urge support and yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back the balance of my time as well.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3547? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
And Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3588, the Community Fire Safety Act of 2013.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3588, a bill to amend the Safe Drinking Water Act to exempt fire hydrants from the prohibition on the use of lead pipes, fittings, fixtures, solder, and flux.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials in the record on the bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, many members think that the suspension calendar is reserved for unimportant legislation. That is not the case today. It is reserved for bills that need no amendments and on which more than two-thirds of the House agrees. The Community Fire Safety Act of 2013 meets those two tests. Sometimes when we budget our time, we ask ourselves, what should I work on first, the urgent or the important? H.R. 3588 is both urgent and important. It corrects a problem that first surfaced in October of this year, but which impacts all water utilities and firefighting units in the United States effective next month. Water utilities have made it clear that they have two choices come January 4th. Fail to comply with federal law or leave gaps in critical fire hydrant service. No one should ever face that choice. Here's the background. On January 4, 2011, the President signed into law the Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act. This law prohibits the manufacturing and installation of pipes, fittings, and fixtures that have lead content of greater than 0.2%. But it exempts specific items, including tub fillers and shower valves. There is also a general exemption for pipes, fittings, and fixtures where the water is not anticipated to be consumed. The effective date of the law is January 4th, 2014, the beginning of next month. Now, I'm told that when Congress wrote this law in 2010 and the President signed it in 2011, the issue of fire hydrants never entered the conversation, nor did the EPA suggest that fire hydrants were covered, at least not until October of this year, 10 short weeks before the law takes effect. On October 22nd, the EPA announced that because fire hydrants are occasionally, but rarely, used in the stream of human water consumption, they are not exempt under the Act. This means any hydrant manufactured or installed 33 days from now must have a lead content that meets the statutory standard. The EPA's conclusion was based on a technical reading of the statute, and because the rule's announcement takes effect in early January, the solution is this brief but important legislation. The worry for water utilities and firefighters is that hydrants can break without warning, often as a result of vehicular accidents. Winter is a busy time for replacing hydrants, due in part to freezing road conditions. But neither water utilities nor firefighters can tolerate hydrants that are not certified to meet strict performance standards and parameters. Hydrants must never get stuck closed and should never leak. Why do hydrants contain tiny amounts of lead in the brass alloys in their valves and other parts? Because that alloy gives a cleaner fit that doesn't leak and doesn't get stuck. Confidence that a hydrant meets this standard is crucial. Mr. Speaker, even though a couple of manufacturers claim to have developed hydrants that could meet today's lead-free standard, none of them claims independent verification of the lead-free standard, much less proof that the extreme low-lead hydrant will work for fire safety. If such hydrants are developed and later certified, communities will certainly always be free to choose them. But in the meantime, the 2010 law is unforgiving. It does not allow exemptions for even the least frequent and briefest exposures to water that may pass through a hydrant. Communities that never allow any human consumption of water from a hydrant will be barred from installing hydrants that today are in stock and ready to meet emergency repairs. The risk to human health from lead in water is from long-term exposure. That's why there is no scientific data showing health effects from people drinking water from hydrants. But there are documented times when firefighters have arrived on the emergency scene only to find the hydrant is out of service. This leads to tragedy we can and must avoid. If shower valves and tub fillers should be exempt, and they are, let's exempt hydrants so that there are no gaps in fire safety. I urge a yes vote on H.R. 3855 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself such time as I will require.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be here with my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, in support of H.R. 3588. As we heard 3 years ago, Congress passed important legislation to reduce lead in drinking water supplies by eliminating a very significant remaining source of lead, our water delivery infrastructure. The Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act amended the Safe Drinking Water Act to address the high levels of lead documented in the drinking water in many communities. Lead is a very dangerous contaminant, and it is especially dangerous to our children. It is retained in their bodies and leads to a host of chronic problems. We need to remove lead from our drinking water, but we do not need to regulate fire hydrants to achieve this worthy and important goal. Fire hydrants are rarely used to provide drinking water, And those rare occasions are during emergencies. For instance, the break of a water main. And when these rare events occur, flushing the hydrant is sufficient to ensure that lead and other contaminants are not conveyed in the water. As sometimes happens, Mr. Speaker, laws have unintended consequences. When Congress passed the amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act 3 years ago, I doubt anyone intended to have EPA regulate fire hydrants. EPA hosted a webinar on this issue recently. The agency consulted stakeholders from the hydrant manufacturing industry, municipalities from across our country, state and city regulatory agencies, and water supply companies. These sources provided the agency with information to demonstrate that regulating hydrants would be expensive to implement and it would deliver virtually no additional public health benefits. Closer to home, I heard from 2 municipalities in my district, Latham and Colony, both in Albany County. Their local leaders were very concerned about the expense of replacing their inventory of fire hydrants and about problems that could arise if they were unable to service and replace hydrants in a timely manner. As we all know, fire hydrants are a vital part of the safety infrastructure of every community, large or small across this great country. I am told the average cost is as high as $2,000 per hydrant, if not more. Most communities keep a reserve inventory so that hydrants can be replaced as needed. Without this fix, communities across the country would be spending millions to replace inventories of working hydrants. Not only would communities have to replace their inventory of hydrants, but there is a real question about the availability of lead-free alternatives. The supply of lead-free hydrants is still small, and some newer designs have yet to be tested and certified fully. Well, we certainly do not need to impose unnecessary costs on our communities across this country. We can fix this problem, and we are moving forward with a sound and effective solution today. H.R. 3588 adds fire hydrants to the list of plumbing fixtures and other components of water infrastructure that are exempted from the requirements to reduce lead. H.R. 3588 is a simple, bipartisan bill that provides a straightforward correction to the law. It will save our communities money and time, 2 very important commodities. In addition, the bill contains a provision requiring the EPA administrator to consult with the Drinking Water Advisory Council on options for reducing lead in our drinking water in a cost-effective manner. Hopefully, this dialogue will provide more cost-effective options for achieving a worthy goal: cleaner, safer drinking water. Again, I want to commend my colleague, our colleague, Representative Johnson, for his work on this legislation, and thank him for working together with me to ensure that communities can concentrate on efforts that will bring true public health improvements to our citizens and avoid unnecessary expenses that achieve no real benefits. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further members that wish to speak on this issue. If my good friend Mr. Tonko is prepared to summarize, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman reserves.
That I reserve.
Gentleman.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I have no other speakers here on our side. Again, I want to thank the gentleman from Ohio. I want to thank Chairman Upton of the Energy and Commerce Committee and Ranking Member Waxman of the same committee for expediting this very important bill. And again, I urge all of our colleagues to support this worthy legislation. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I too want to say thanks to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Tonko, for his support of this legislation. It may seem trivial to some, but trust me, it's not trivial to the many communities who are sitting on stockpiles, literally millions of dollars worth of current hydrant technology that would have to be replaced. as a result, and that money just going down the tubes. I, too, urge a yes vote on H.R. 3588, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 3588? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Request yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately 6:30 p.m. today.